Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Backer and welcome to this episode of Write Better Stories. Today, helping us write better stories, is an author by the name of Djuna Barnes with her amazing novel, Nightwood. Or novella novel, I don't really care about the difference. This is an amazing book, and I'm actually planning on doing a much longer edited video where I talk about it in greater detail, but I was so excited in preparing for that video that I decided to do a slightly shorter video talking about prose, scene work, character action, and a lot of the elements that I consider the bare bones of story that I talk about in this channel a lot. And I was actually going to give a bunch of historical context on the passage that I was about to read, but instead I'm just going to dive into it and then see if, based on these two, or I think it's just one, based on this one short paragraph, I'm going to see if you can infer some historical context, and then I'm going to go through and discuss this technique that I think that she's doing where she begins as summary and then transitions into scene. And so if that doesn't make sense to you, the difference between summary and scene, I will talk about it after I read the passage, but I think sometimes it's easy for us to draw a stark opposition between summary and scene, and Djuna Barnes does a great example of this seamless transition where she starts the paragraph as summary, ends it as scene, showcasing a very evocative character action. So without further ado, I'm going to be reading a single paragraph from Nightwood by Djuna Barnes and then talking about it, and this is on page 6 of my edition if you would like to follow along. He had tried to be one with her by adoring her, by imitating her goosestep of a stride, a step that by him adopted became dislocated and comic. She would have done as much, but sensing something in him blasphemed and lonely, she had taken the blow as a Gentile must, by moving toward him in recoil. She had believed whatever he had told her, but often enough she had asked, "What is the matter?" That continual reproach, which was meant as a continual reminder of her love. It ran through his life like an accusing voice. He had been tormented into speaking highly of royalty, flinging out encomiums with the force of small water made great by the pressure of a thumb. He had laughed too heartily when in the presence of the lower order of title, as if, by his good nature, he could advance them to some distinction of which they dreamed. Confronted with nothing worse than a general in creaking leather with the slight repercussion of movement common to military men who seemed to breathe from the inside out, smelling of gunpowder and horseflesh, lethargic yet prepared for participation in a war yet not yet scheduled, a type of which Hedwig had been very fond, Guido had shaken with an unseen trembling. He saw that Hedwig had the same bearing, the same, though more condensed power of the hand patterned on seizure in a smaller mold, as sinister in its reduction as a doll's house. The feather in her hat had been knife-clean and quivering as if in a heraldic wind. She had been a woman held up to nature, precise, deep-bosomed, and gay. Looking at the two, he had become confused as if he were about to receive a reprimand. Not the officer's, but his wife's. Okay, so hopefully I read that clearly enough for you there. I flubbed a couple lines, but hopefully I gave you the overall impression of what she was trying to do there. And there is a ton that we can talk about in this single paragraph. And so that's why, if you haven't read this book yet, first of all, I don't think I've really spoiled it with this section just because it's literally only one paragraph on page 6, and it's about characters that end up being a little bit more background in the story. But those characters are named Guido and Hedwig. I think I'm saying Hedwig right. It is spelled with a V, and I looked up the phonetic translation online, their phonetic pronunciation. So they're a married couple, and as the passage shows, through my reading of it, obviously, they have a tumultuous relationship, and further background on their relationship is the fact that Guido, the husband, is actually a Jewish man who is adopting Christian customs in order to pass as a Christian, and he does this by basically pretending that he is the end of this lineage of these barons in Austria, and it's totally fabricated. He created a fake painting of his supposed parents that basically passed on this baronry to him, and his wife does not know that he's not actually a real baron, but she's a little suspicious about it. And so what's really interesting in this section here is that we get a great summary of Guido's relationship with his wife and this sort of suspicion that she has toward his own security and his identity as a baron, as a Christian person, etc. So let me pick out a few lines from that so that you can see specifically this odd thing. So literally in the first sentence of this paragraph, speaking of Guido, it says, he had tried to be one with her by adoring her, by imitating her goose step of a stride, a step that by him adopted became dislocated and comic. So even though that this is delivered to us in summary, we can basically imagine him doing this goose step of a stride, which is traditionally associated, I believe, with sort of like the Aryan like Nazis, right? And so I don't know if historically that's what she's referring to here, but at the very least, when Djuna Barnes says the word goosestep, we're to think of like an officious march, and it basically introduces this military essence that Hedwig has. Hedwig is Guido's wife. And so not only do we get the image of her introduced as having this sort of military spirit and like a very stern countenance and demeanor, we get this really interesting showcase of Guido trying to pretend that he likewise feels this way, that he's imitating her goose step of a stride, and it's dislocated and comic. And so it's sort of like obvious, and we get why she's probably suspicious about his feelings toward his own identity, because he can't really pass. He can lie about it. He can tell people that he is this Austrian baron, or maybe he's Roman, I kind of forget. But the idea is that he's pretending to be something that he's not, and we can imagine Hedwig looking at him just being like, you know, I mean, he's doing everything that you're supposed to do, but it just doesn't seem natural on him. So, continuing through this little summary scene, Djuna Barnes does something very interesting with her descriptions that, one, you can use to write better stories and elevate your prose, but two, almost the entire book is united by this style, in my opinion anyway, and that's this particular attention to using contrasting descriptions and maybe paradoxes to describe almost everything in the book. So let me give you a few examples of that. Just from this second sentence here, it says that she'd taken the blow, that there was something, so I'm sorry, just to go in order, it says that she sensed something in him blasphemed and lonely, so something a little bit counterfeit and withdrawn, about him, but she took the blow as a Gentile must, and that is by moving toward him in recoil. This is a really interesting thing that she's doing here, is that she's showing this wife's suspicion of her husband, but instead of pulling away, she adopts this basically Christian mentality of basically rubbing their nose in the suffering, and Hedwig is obviously embarrassed by Guido to a certain extent, but instead of confronting him about this, she basically cares for him, but does it almost with like a cringe on her face. That's the image that's evoked by moving toward him in recoil. And so I'm going to get more into Djuna Barnes's use of this contrasting descriptions and paradox of basically pairing two things that you wouldn't necessarily think. I'm going to get into that in a later video, but I had to talk about it here. And this next line in this paragraph further exemplifies that when Djuna Barnes writes, she had believed whatever he had told her, but often enough she had asked, what is the matter? That continual reproach, which was meant as a continual reminder of her love. So again, like we wouldn't really usually think of a reproach as something that would be a sign of somebody's love. But this is another example of Djuna Barnes using that paradoxical or contrasting descriptions in order to get at a much more complicated human emotion within this relationship. That I can actually personally relate to this. I feel like, especially when I was a young man and people would ask me what was wrong, I would interpret that as, what is wrong with you? You know, and then obviously you don't want to have to own up to that, especially as a young person who's still figuring themselves out. But this is even more tragic and evocative, I think, in this, because this is this man's wife that's asking him, what's the matter? And it does come across as he's being accused of something terrible, even though she's meaning it or doing it from this caring position. Like, you could argue that maybe she's doing this passive aggressively, like pretending to care, but really judging him and hating him for not being authentic and secure in the fact that he is this baron, or tells everyone that he's this baron. And I think that yeah, literally the next line even says, it ran through his life like an accusing voice. So I'm going to get off of that description of the contrasting descriptions, and I'm going to dive into that in much greater detail in a later video, but just to give you a little taste of that, you can use that in your stories to basically, yeah, say more complicated things about relationships. And so here is where we get into this main technique that I'm trying to identify in this paragraph that you can use in your stories, because the whole contrasting descriptions and paradoxes thing is pretty specific, and so if your whole story isn't about that, maybe it would distract from it. That would be sort of you to decide, and the details of your story would determine that. But the move that I think that you can use in any sort of story that you're writing is the seamless transition between summary and scene. And so just to identify specifically where the summary goes into the scene, I'll point that out and then describe what I mean by summary and scene after that. And so as far as I can tell, it's summary all through the paragraph, up through the line. He had laughed too heartily when in the presence of the lower order of title, as if by his good nature he could advance them to some distinction of which they dreamed. So just in case that doesn't make sense, basically he's pretending to be this baron, and when he sees people that rank lower than him, he puts on like kind of an unbelievable performance of saying all these great things that he could offer them as this baron, but it apparently doesn't feel authentic. And so this is when, in the next sentence, I'm convinced that it transitions into a scene, but it's done so subtly, there's no paragraph break or anything. But we get into, confronted with nothing worse than a general in creaking leather with the slight repercussion of movement common to military men who seem to breathe from the inside out, smelling of gunpowder and horseflesh, lethargic yet prepared for participation in a war not yet scheduled, a type of which Hedwig had been very fond, Guido had shaken with an unseen trembling. And so this is where I believe it transitions into a scene, because the line before that, we say that like, oh, whenever he sees a lower rank, he tries to advance them. But then on this particular time, he comes upon somebody that he thinks is a lower rank, but is basically a general, as far as he can tell. And if I'm reading that correctly. So nothing worse than a general in creaking leather. So yeah, so then we basically see Guido kind of put his foot in his mouth, that he puts on airs that he is this baron, and then it's revealed that this person is basically not only a higher ranking person, but just a much more authentically authoritarian Austrian military presence, much like his wife, which is what the remainder of the scene goes on to describe. So looking at this general and his wife, we have this cool image of Guido basically realizing that his wife is very similar to this general, both in authenticity as an Austrian and in her military presence. So, her military vibe that she gives off. So, speaking of Guido, Djuna Barnes writes, he saw that Hedwig had the same bearing, the same, though more condensed power of the hand, patterned on seizure in a smaller mold, as sinister in its reduction as a doll's house. The feather in her hat had been knife clean and quivering as if in a heraldic wind. She had been a woman held up to nature, precise, deep-bosomed, and gay. Looking at the two, he had become confused if he were about to receive a reprimand. Not the officer's, but his wife's. So, specifically, that last line really solidifies this comparison that he's making and him feeling like the odd man out, is that, like, we would presume that he would be closer to his wife than his wife would be to this general, but he feels like an outsider, even looking at this woman that shares a bed with him and this stranger, as far as I'm concerned. I don't think they actually detail it in the paragraph. But yeah, specifically writing, looking at the two, had become confused as if he were about to receive a reprimand, not the officer's, but his wife. So I think that's fairly straightforward, but I'll still describe it just so that we're all on the same page, is that he's looking at them, and obviously a military officer is somebody that would traditionally give a command, but when they're right next to each other, it's as though his wife is going to basically give him these commands, thus fulfilling her military presence and her sort of officious, stiff upper lip vibe. And he's feeling like an outsider. And so this really goes to show Guido and Hedwig's character relationship, but specifically that Guido does not feel authentic. He doesn't feel comfortable in his own skin because he's been living this lie. And a lot of the first several pages of Nightwood are about that, about how Guido basically embodies the archetype of like the wandering Jew and always feels like an outsider everywhere that he goes. And he ends up giving birth. He impregnates Hedwig, who gives birth to a character named Felix, who becomes more important as the story goes on. And I'm going to get into all of that business in my later video, but just to give a few more details about this summary and scene thing that I discussed. And I understand, like, I didn't really unpack every line of this thing because it's so dense. She's such an incredible writer that every paragraph you can say so many things about. And I actually was writing down notes in my notebook to talk about different pages that I was going to talk about in my next video. And my notes literally were like, paragraph 1, page 1, paragraph 2, page 2. Like every single page ended up getting a pretty significant note about it. So that's going to be my task for creating that longer video. But just to give you what I told you I was going to give you, summary and scene are two fairly straightforward concepts when it comes to writing a piece of fiction. And the difference between them is basically, when writing a summary, are you giving a sort of general overview of the main points of something happening? And so you can frame this grammatically in your head as something that somebody like usually does. So it would be the difference between me saying, Tom poured himself a glass of water, and on Tuesdays, Tom enjoys pouring himself a glass of water. You know, like when we say enjoys, it's a more habitual, repeated action, whereas the scene version of that is Tom literally is pouring this glass of water in a specific moment. So just to give you another example of that actually from the text, is that at the beginning of this paragraph from Nightwood, we have a pretty definitive summary that we're talking about Guido in general, that he had tried to be one with her by adoring her, by imitating her goose-step of a stride. She would have done as much. It's like all these things. He had done this, she would do that. This general information about the character. And I think that it's important to identify what summary is versus scene, because sometimes people think of scene as only when the dialogue is happening and everything else is just the setting. So like we're either writing dialogue between characters or discussing what color the drapes are, or saying the time of day and the temperature outside. And obviously in summary and in prose, in non-scenic writing, you are allowed to describe the setting, but you have so many more options that your prose can be summaries of much more abstract internal things about the characters or habitual repeated action. So then scene, on the other hand, as I already discussed, is a very specific moment that we are to believe is happening like a movie scene in front of us. The action is happening. It is non-summary. It's not just the kind of glossing over the main things that happened. It is concrete right in front of us. Now, I am about to run out of battery, and so I'm going to have to vomit this out really fast at you guys just to end up. But basically, what makes this such an amazing technique in this book is that she seamlessly transitions between these things. We talk about this habitual repeated action of all of these sort of phony things that Guido does in order to keep up his pretense that he's a baron. But then when he's actually exposed, it cuts to a scene, but it doesn't even break paragraph. It's not Djuna Barnes saying, oh, by the way, now we're actually cutting to a scene. She very seamlessly, almost secretively, transitions into the scene where we have this general and this beautiful image of Guido looking at this general and his wife and basically feeling very insecure about it. And so just since my battery's about to die, I'm going to leave it there. I hope that the information that I discussed today will help you write better stories.